Hey, what is up everybody, it's Animac here for Anime Uproar, and we finally know every single quirk that all 10 current and former One For All users had possessed over the course of many generations. Well, we have 9 full-time users and 1 temporary user. Since the final quirk was just revealed recently, I thought that this would be the perfect time to update all of our information and explain all the users and all their quirks right here in one place. I will also explain how the evolution of One For All itself has completely changed these quirks over time and made it possible to use incredible combo super moves, so let's get into it. You guys know how this works. If you enjoy our MHA videos and you want to see more in the future, leave a quick like and comment right now. It only takes you a second, it's really quick, but it helps us out with that YouTube algorithm. And if you're new to the channel, or maybe you just haven't taken the time to subscribe yet, do me a huge favor and make this the video that you subscribe and hit that notification bell to turn on all notifications. It is a completely free but very real way of directly supporting the channel. Finally, this video will contain MHA manga spoilers in terms of the quirks, their users, and how the quirks work. I will try to avoid major plot spoilers, but the manga is far ahead of the anime, so you have been warned. First up, we have the 9th and current One For All user, our protagonist Izuku Midoriya, also known as Deku. Deku's lifelong dream was to become a great hero just like his idol, All Might. But Deku was born quirkless in a world where at least 80% of people are born with quirks. The fact that he didn't have a quirk made it very difficult for Deku to become a successful pro hero, because the other heroes who had extremely powerful quirks had a huge advantage over him. Not to mention the fact that the villains also have powerful quirks, so a quirkless hero would have a very difficult time holding his own against them. Now, I remember when this series began, some people were hoping that Deku wouldn't get a quirk and that he would just use his intelligence and modern technology to fight villains, kind of like Batman. But unfortunately for Deku, he is not an eccentric billionaire, so becoming Batman wasn't really an option. Everything changed for Deku after a chance meeting with Toshinori Yagi, whose other alias is the legendary pro hero All Might. After seeing Deku's courage and commitment to becoming a hero despite being born quirkless, All Might decided to transfer his own quirk, One For All, to Deku. One For All is an extremely unique quirk that can be transferred from one person to another, and the transfer can happen only if the current user willingly allows the new user to consume some of their DNA. In the case of Deku, All Might had him consume a strand of his hair, and although this is a little weird, it also gave us a ton of great memes. When he first inherited the quirk, Deku had a very hard time controlling it, and he would constantly hurt himself every time he tried to use it. And I mean, like, he would seriously hurt himself. He would break a finger or an arm, and he would need serious medical attention. But thanks to some intense training, incredible dedication, and top-tier mentorship from both All Might and Gran Torino, Deku eventually learned to control how much of One For All's power he uses when he attacks. And so he was able to use the quirk effectively without constantly injuring himself. And once Deku actually learned to use his quirk in a way that allows him to stay out of the hospital, he was able to practice with it and discover its true potential and its insane versatility. Since we already talked a bit about Toshinori Yagi, also known as the symbol of peace, All Might, we might as well focus on him next. Much like Deku, All Might was born without a quirk, and this was part of the reason why All Might instantly connected with Deku and was able to relate to him on a personal level. Despite being born quirkless, All Might inherited One For All from his master, Nana Shimura, and he was a user of One For All for 40 years. This is significantly longer than any other user in One For All's history, and the reason for this is revealed later on in the story. During his time as the wielder of One For All Might became a legendary hero and the symbol of peace, and he was actually able to defeat the most notorious villain in the history of Japan, All For One, on 2 separate occasions. All For One has been the greatest nemesis of every single One For All user ever since the quirk was first created, and yet no user was ever able to defeat him before All Might. Needless to say, All Might's tenure as the user of One For All was historic in many ways. By finally defeating All For One and forcing the arch-villain into hiding, All Might brought an end to the chaos caused by All For One's villainous schemes and ushered in an era of peace. Because of this, All Might literally became the symbol of peace. The man who brought the entire hero society together and made everyone feel safe. In that sense, All Might really blazed the trail for the next generation of heroes, including of course Deku, but also Bakugo, Stars and Stripes, and many others. All Might had a very strong and resilient body, so he was able to adapt to One For All very quickly, and he didn't have to struggle as much as Deku in order to master the quirk. In fact, All Might was so good at using One For All that he became the strongest hero in history back when he was in his prime. But by the time that All Might met Deku, he was nowhere near his prime. He had been permanently injured in a previous battle against All For One, which severely limited his ability to use One For All. His body simply could not handle using the quirk for more than a few hours a day, and at that point it became clear that All Might had to find a successor. After transferring the quirk to Deku, All Might still had some remaining embers of One For All which he was able to call upon in battle, but eventually those embers were extinguished and he became effectively quirkless once again. As a result, All Might retired from being a pro hero, and his main job now is to mentor his successor, Deku. He's basically Alfred now, and he does drive a sick Batmobile. Next up is the 7th One For All user and All Might's former master, Nana Shimura. Nana had a close personal and professional relationship with Gran Torino, and she is also the grandmother of Tomura Shigaraki, whose birth name is Tenko Shimura. When he was still very young, Nana gave up her son Kotaro Shimura and had him raised with a foster family in order to protect him from All For One. Nana did this after All For One had already killed her husband, and so Nana knew that her war against All For One was putting her son in direct danger. She didn't give up her son because she didn't want him. She gave him up because she felt that this was the only way to save his life. As a user of One For All, she was a constant target for All For One and the villains, and so was everyone who was close to her. So for that reason, she decided to give up her son in order to take him out of harm's way. Nevertheless, Nana's son Kotaro felt hurt and rejected by his mother after she gave him up to a foster family. He didn't see this as her making a massive sacrifice in order to protect him. He saw it as her choosing her pro hero career over him. After all, if Nana had just retired from being a pro hero, then she would no longer be a target for All For One, and the two of them could have lived happily as a family. As a result, Kotaro began to despise both heroes and the hero profession, and when he grew up and had a family of his own, he allowed this hatred to affect the way that he treated his son, Tenko. Little Tenko Shimura dreamt of one day becoming a pro hero. But every time he brought that up in front of his father, he was faced with criticism and outright abuse from Kotaro. Ironically, Nana abandoned her son in order to protect him from dangerous villains. But Kotaro's abandonment issues, which led to his hatred of heroes, ultimately played a pivotal role in creating the monster that we know today as Tomura Shigaraki. Unlike Deku and All Might, Nana wasn't born quirkless. Before inheriting One For All, she possessed her own quirk called Float, which allowed her to levitate through the air. Now, just levitating through the air on its own isn't the most useful quirk in battle. Floating around like a balloon or something is not the same as rapidly flying through the air to any destination of your choosing. However, when combined with One For All, Float becomes a much more useful and powerful quirks. That is because the stockpiled energy from One For All can be used to propel someone who is using Float to the exact location that they want to go, which essentially allows them to fly at great speeds. Thanks to One For All, Float goes from being a floating quirk to an overpowered flying quirk, and once he unlocks it, Deku is able to make great use of it, both in terms of his mobility and in terms of his offensive capability. Nana Shimura was eventually killed by All For One, but as I said earlier, she was able to pass the One For All quirk onto All Might before that happened. And that is actually similar to the way in which she first received the One For All quirk from the 6th user, N. And so now let's talk about the 6th user, One For All. N, spelled En, is a relatively short man with dark hair and a high-collared dressing style that is reminiscent of Best Jeanist. As far as we know right now, there is no direct connection between Best Jeanist and N, so these similarities could be just a coincidence. N's original quirk is called Smokescreen, and it allows its user to generate smoke and severely reduce his opponent's visibility on the battlefield. The smoke can be spread over a very large area, meaning that the user can potentially obscure visibility throughout an entire battlefield, which can certainly make things a lot harder for the user's opponent or opponents. But N readily acknowledges that his quirk is not particularly strong, and it has no offensive capabilities. Its effectiveness can also be limited by weather, such as when it rains, and if the user isn't careful, he could end up reducing his own visibility along with his opponent's. Smokescreen is by no means a super quirk on its own, but when used in combination with One For All and its other quirks, it can be a very useful tool in Deku's arsenal. Personally, I like the fact that some One For All users like N didn't have an overpowered quirk of their own before inheriting One For All. The person with the strongest quirk will not necessarily be the best candidate for inheriting One For All. So it makes sense that some users will have strong quirks, others will have weaker quirks, and others still will be quirkless. All For One tried to steal One For All from N on 2 separate occasions, and he failed both times. N became the 6th user of One For All when he consumed the blood of the 5th user, Daigoro Banjo, right before he himself died at the hands of All For One. Speaking of which, the 5th user, Daigoro Banjo, was an eccentric and funktastic pro hero whose official hero name was Lariat. Banjo's appearance is sometimes compared to the character Hellboy, and since we know that Horikoshi is a massive fan of Western comics, it is likely that Hellboy influenced Banjo's design. Just like N, Banjo stopped All For One from stealing One For All on at least 2 separate occasions. And he was well known for being a highly energetic hero with incredible willpower and a powerful quirk. He was also a muscular, stylish, and super funky dude, and his original quirk, Black Whip, was the first new quirk that Deku unlocked as part of One For All's awakening. Black Whip allows its user to generate black tendrils from his body and use these tendrils to either attack an opponent, restrain an opponent, or increase the versatility of the user's own movements. Black Whip is an extremely useful quirk, and it appears to be powered by strong emotions such as anger. This means that the angrier the user becomes while still maintaining control of his senses, the stronger the quirk will become. Black Whip can also be combined with other quirks in extremely effective ways, such as when Deku combines Black Whip with Fa Jin to create a new super move called Black Chain. Aside from One For All itself, Black Whip is one of the linchpins of Deku's power, and its versatility allows Deku to combine it with other quirks in extremely effective ways. As I mentioned earlier, Banjo was killed by All For One, but just before dying he was able to pass One For All on to N. So now let's talk about the person from whom Banjo had inherited One For All in the first place, which is the 4th user of One For All, Hikage Shinomori. Hikage has 2 lines that resemble scars running down the left side of his face, and unlike the other One For All users, the 4th user chose to avoid confronting All For One head on. Instead, he lived on his own in the wilderness like a hermit because he didn't want All For One to find him and try to steal One For All from him. He knew that he couldn't defeat All For One on his own, so he dedicated his life to training and strengthening the One For All quirk in order to make it stronger. Since One For All is a stockpiling quirk, it will become stronger over time. So Hikage was betting on the future generation, and he was hoping that his eventual successor would be strong enough to defeat All For One, even if he himself would never be. Hikage spent 18 years cultivating and strengthening the One For All quirk, but his body eventually began to break down as a result of actively using One For All for so many years. The scars on his face appear to have been caused by the physical breakdown which he experienced. And although he was never caught or killed by All For One, in the end, Hikage died of old age when he was only 40 years old, although not before passing One For All on to Daigoro Banjo. It was later revealed that all users who already had a quirk before inheriting One For All would experience a similar physical breakdown if they lived long enough. That's because trying to juggle both One For All and another separate quirk is simply too much for the human body to handle. And so as it turns out, the ideal One For All user is one who started out quirkless, like All Might and Deku. They do not experience the same type of physical breakdown no matter how many years they live with One For All, which is why All Might was able to use it for 40 years without dying. The original quirk that Hikage was born with is called Danger Sense, and it allows its user to instantly identify imminent threats in the surrounding area. It's essentially a spidey sense, and just like Smokescreen, it can be very useful in battle, but it doesn't necessarily have offensive capabilities on its own. Once Deku unlocks the ability to use the quirk, he describes it as a sharp stabbing sensation in his head, which alerts him that danger is coming. The quirk can sense both imminent physical threats and negative human intentions and emotions. However, the quirk does not react when someone attacks Deku without malicious intent. So Danger Sense has one fatal weakness, and it's called Yandere Girls. If a yandere girl like Toga attacks Deku out of affection rather than out of ill intent, Danger Sense will not activate. Again, this is not a quirk that will allow you to defeat an opponent on its own, but in combination with the other One For All quirks, it is extremely useful in battle. For example, you can use Smokescreen as much as you want and still know where your opponent is because of Danger Sense. Now let's talk about the third One For All user, whose name has still not been revealed. He was a prominent member of the resistance movement that fought against All For One when he was first establishing himself as the villain overlord of Japan. Along with the second One For All user, he identified where All For One's younger brother Yoichi was being held, and he broke into the compound with the intention of assassinating him. But after realizing that All For One's brother was opposed to what All For One was doing and was being held prisoner for that very reason, the second and third user decided to rescue Yoichi. Yoichi would eventually be killed by his own brother, All For One, but before he died, he transferred One For All to the second One For All user. The second One For All user soon met the same fate, but not before transferring the quirk to the third One For All user. That process was then repeated again when the third user transferred One For All to Hikage, and so on. The third user's original quirk is called Fajin. This quirk allows its user to build up kinetic energy in their body by repeating regular movements, and this energy can then be stored up and used later. When enough energy is built up, the user can use it to release superhuman bursts of strength and speed. The user has the ability to control how much energy is being released at what time, so it doesn't all need to be released at once, it can be released in multiple bursts. Fajin was a much weaker quirk before the third user inherited One For All, but because both Fajin and One For All are stockpiling quirks, the power of Fajin increases drastically when it is coupled with the power of One For All. For example, when he unlocks the ability to use it, Deku is able to combine Fajin with 45% of One For All's power and Black Whip to achieve levels of strength and speed that are on par with using 100% of One For All if it were being used on its own, with the added benefit that Deku's body doesn't have to suffer the physical consequences of outright using 100% One For All. The name Fajin was inspired by a term in Chinese martial arts that refers to discharging power in a sudden and explosive manner. Then we have the second One For All user, whose quirk was the last one to be revealed in chapter 368 of the story. The second user was a man with spiky hair and an X-shaped scar across his face who kinda looks like an adult Bakugo. Back when he was alive, he used to wear a pair of gauntlets on his arms as part of his costume, and he was also present at Yoichi's rescue along with the third user. The second user is believed to have been the leader of the resistance movement that tried to stop All For One's takeover of Japan. And because he believed that the goal of stopping All For One was incredibly important for the entire world, he was willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done, including potentially killing people who got in his way. After all, at first he was planning to assassinate Yoichi just because Yoichi was close to All For One, but he eventually changed his mind when he realized that the Resistance and Yoichi share the same goal. Due to the extremely hard times that he lived in, hard times that required hard decisions, the second user along with the third user initially refused to accept Deku as a worthy one-for-all successor. They felt that Deku's outlook on life was too naive and optimistic, and that he wasn't willing to get his hands dirty when the situation required it, which could be a big problem during an intense, high-stakes battle. They felt that Deku simply didn't have it in him to kill anyone, not even a dangerous villain, and so he didn't have what it takes to be a true successor for the one-for-all Quirk. Nevertheless, the second and third users eventually changed their opinions of Deku after Yoichi convinced them to trust him, and after seeing some of Deku's recent actions. The second user has an extremely powerful quirk, and it is much more powerful now that it has been combined with One For All. In fact, this quirk is so powerful that it can be very dangerous, and the second user tells Deku to only use it as a last resort. The quirk's name is Transmission, sometimes translated as Gear Shift, and it allows its user to shift the speed of anything he touches. The user can use it on himself to make his own movements much faster, and he can also use it to shift the speed of his opponent after making direct contact with him. The first time we see Deku using the quirk, he demonstrates its incredible power by increasing his own speed, then punching Shigaraki upward and increasing the villain's speed, then switching gears to increase his own speed even further. He goes into second gear and punches Shigaraki again even faster. Then he goes into third gear and punches him again. Then he goes into top gear and punches him yet again. At one point, Shigaraki and Deku begin to move at such incredible speed that Mirio notices that the sound of Deku's punches is actually delayed. Deku eventually catches up to the rapidly moving Shigaraki and even overtakes him using the transmission quirk's ultimate gear, Overdrive. Deku then punches down on Shigaraki with a brutal Detroit smash. The power of Deku's downward punch smashes against all of that upward momentum that Shigaraki's body had built up after being punched multiple times, and this creates an absolutely devastating attack. And in fact, by using the transmission quirk in combination with Detroit Smash, the power of this Detroit Smash goes from 100% to 120%, making it even stronger than the legendary 100% One For All. Just like other quirks that are now part of One For All, the second user's quirk used to be much weaker than it is today. In fact, its power now is practically unrecognizable. All For One remembers that back when the second user was still alive, his quirk was just a pathetic little pea-shooter quirk that was only able to control the speed of small objects. The second user could control small objects and launch them at his opponents, but that was pretty much it. Back then, the second user presented absolutely no challenge to All For One, and All For One eliminated him as a threat without much trouble. But now that transmission is being used by Deku, things are very different. One For All is of course a stockpiling quirk, and it has been stockpiling power for many decades. And so as One For All became stronger, so did all of the quirks that had been residing inside of it, including Transmission. And not only is Transmission itself stronger, but Deku is also able to use combo quirks, such as using Transmission and One For All at the same time, or Transmission and Fajin at the same time, etc. The end result of all of this is something completely different from what All For One remembers. The raw stockpiled power of One For All, combining with Transmission, packs enough power to bend even the laws of physics. The second user explains that Transmission allows him to change his speed while ignoring inertia, meaning that the speed of Deku's movements is literally beyond the laws of physics. He is changing the speed of things on a cellular level. And so our normal understanding of things like inertia, momentum, acceleration, and deceleration simply don't apply anymore. It goes without saying that at this point in time, Transmission is an absolutely overpowered quirk, and it provides an amazing addition to Deku's quirk roster. And finally, let's talk about the very first user of One For All, the younger brother of All For One, Yoichi Shigaraki. Yoichi and his older brother were born many generations ago, at a time when quirks were first beginning to manifest in people. Initially, the two brothers seemed to have a good relationship, and they enjoyed reading superhero comics together. They were especially fans of a comic called Captain Hero, and while Yoichi related to the hero of the story, Captain Hero, his older brother was actually a fan of the hero's primary nemesis, the Demon Lord. Eventually, the sudden appearance of quirks threw society into chaos as people simply didn't know how to deal with them. And at this point, it became evident that the two brothers held completely different worldviews. All For One wanted to exploit the chaos in order to seize power and create a new world in his own image. Meanwhile, Yoichi believed that heroic individuals with quirks should use their power to restore order and justice. But All For One was born with an incredibly powerful quirk, so he had a clear edge over his younger brother. In fact, while All For One had one of the strongest quirks in history, at first everyone believed that Yoichi was born quirkless, because his quirk never manifested in any noticeable way. Even when he was believed to be quirkless, Yoichi tried to oppose the actions of his older brother because he believed that what All For One was doing was fundamentally wrong. But of course, Yoichi wasn't strong enough to threaten All For One in any way. And because Yoichi was the only family that All For One had, and because he posed no threat to him, the villain didn't outright kill his brother. Instead, he kept him as a prisoner in the hopes that he could one day convince his brother to see things his way. All For One also felt bad that his little brother was born quirkless, and he felt that maybe Yoichi would understand All For One's perspective if he also had a strong quirk like his older brother. So the older brother decided to give the younger brother a stockpiling quirk that he had obtained using the powers of the All For One quirk. Nevertheless, it turned out that All For One's brother did actually have a quirk. But this quirk's only ability was to transfer itself onto another user. Since this was literally all it ever did, it was basically useless and it never manifested in any way. But once the stockpiling quirk was transferred into Yoichi by All For One, it merged with the transferring quirk, and out of these two completely different quirks, the quirk we know today as One For All was born. Yoichi was eventually freed from his captivity by the two members of the resistance movement that we had talked about earlier. These are the two guys who would eventually become the second and third users of One For All. Yoichi clearly had a strong sense of right and wrong, and even though All For One was his own brother, once he was freed, he worked tirelessly to bring his brother down. Unfortunately, Yoichi was simply too weak to actually threaten All For One, and he is presumed to have lost his life in a fight against All For One and his minions. But before he died, Yoichi did manage to transfer his quirk to a successor. That successor was of course the second One For All user. Yoichi believed that even if he himself was unable to stop All For one day as One For All becomes stronger, a successor will emerge who will finally be strong enough to defeat All For One. And as we know now, Yoichi was right because All Might did eventually defeat All For One. And All Might's successor Deku is in the process of becoming even stronger than All Might. And although we just covered all the permanent full-time One For All users, we do have to also quickly talk about the 10th user who only used One For All temporarily, but he did indeed use it. I am talking about Katsuki Bakugo, who uses One For All alongside Deku during their battle against the villain 9 in the My Hero Academia Heroes Rising movie. When Deku realizes that he won't be able to defeat 9 on his own, he gives some of his blood to Bakugo, thereby transferring his DNA onto his friend. This allows Bakugo to use One For All, and he instantly proves to be extremely skilled using it, probably because he has been watching Deku so closely for such a long time. He is able to use One For All full cowl 100% without doing serious damage to his body, and he is also able to use One For All to make his own quirk Explosion even stronger than before. As the name suggests, Bakugo's quirk allows him to create explosions, and thanks to One For All, his explosions became stronger and their temperature increased greatly. At the end of the fight, Bakugo loses his ability to use One For All, while Deku still retains it. This suggests that Deku didn't fully transfer the quirk to Bakugo from himself, but rather that he just let him borrow its powers temporarily. Since we know that the quirk One For All is sentient, it is possible that the vestiges made sure that Deku wouldn't lose the quirk even after allowing Bakugo to borrow some of its power. Because of course they believe that Deku is the one who is destined to unlock the full potential of One For All. So they didn't want Bakugo to actually inherit the quirk from Deku, they just allowed him to borrow some of its power. And in the end, they made sure that the quirk remained inside Deku's body. Now, there is a big debate about whether or not the movies are canon, because they are a bit over the top and they are not directly relevant to the plot of the main series. Some people swear that they are indeed canon, while others swear that they are not. There is no direct indication that the movies are not canon. And in fact, some characters from the movies were later mentioned in the official manga or teased in silhouette form. So we have to treat the movies as at least somewhat relevant to the main story. One For All also has another interesting property that has been extremely useful to its users in the ongoing multi-generational fight against All For One. I mentioned this a bit earlier, but All For One's primary ability is of course to steal the quirks of others. But One For All cannot be transferred from its current user to another user without the consent of the current user. Essentially, One For All cannot be taken away unless the user wills it. Which is why All For One has not been able to steal it for all these years, even though he has definitely been trying. This is also why One For All has been the single most effective weapon against All For One. That said though, All For One has been actively looking for a way to steal One For All for generations. And he now believes that using Tomura Shigaraki's body may allow him to finally steal it. That is because Shigaraki's hatred and willpower just may be strong enough to overcome One For All and its vestiges. And speaking of the vestiges, even though Yoichi sacrificed his life in the fight against All For One, a part of him still lives on as a vestige inside of One For All, and along with all the other former users, he is still guiding the current user of One For All in their common quest to finally defeat All For One. And there it is, everything we know so far about all 9 One For All users and their quirks. How do you feel about the final quirk reveal, and who is your favorite One For All user? Which of their quirks do you think would be most useful to have in real life? Don't forget to share your feedback down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this MHA video and you want to see more in the future, leave a quick like. It only takes a second, but it helps me out a lot. And if you haven't taken the time to subscribe yet, do me a quick favor and make this the video that you subscribe and hit that notification bell to turn on all notifications. You really do have to go through the trouble of subscribing, hitting the bell, and then selecting the option that says all. If you don't go through all of those steps, you're still gonna miss a ton of our videos, even if you are subscribed. That's just how YouTube works. You can also hit me up on Twitter and Instagram at AnimeUproar. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, see ya, Space Cowboys!